Hello and welcome to our webinar today, organized by the Access Forum. My name is Anastasia Papas, and I'm the director of the forum. It's with great pleasure that I welcome Jennifer Blanke today, who is going to talk to us about her research on investing in adaptation economy. I should note that a few years ago, climate economics was almost exclusively focusing on mitigation, with the underlying assumption that the funds that were required for mitigation were so huge that actually we couldn't afford to spend anything on adaptation because it was considered at the time to be a short-term solution. Now, thankfully, the debate has changed, and economists at least do recognize that adaptation is an indispensable component of the transition to net zero. Jennifer goes a step further, though, and her concept of adaptation economy is far more comprehensive than what we have in mind when we think about adaptation. And it's an idea that can actually build a solid foundation that can facilitate the transition to a sustainable global economy. I'm not going to take any more time from her presentation. I will just introduce her to you now. Jennifer is a partner at Morphosis, which is a transformative adaptation solutions business. She's a former vice president for agriculture and human and social development of the African Development Bank, where she was responsible for strategy and lending in agriculture and agro-industry, water and sanitation, education and healthcare, as well as transversal themes of job creation and gender empowerment. Prior to that, she was chief economist at the World Economic Forum, overseeing economic research and analysis. She has also worked as a management consultant in the banking and finance sector for Eurogroup Consulting in Paris, and was a member of the Canadian government's Advisory Council on Economic Growth. She holds a BA in International Relations from Hamilton College, a master's from Columbia University, and a PhD from the Geneva Graduate Institute. Just a quick note to let you know that you can post your questions either on the chat function or on questions. So Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Anastasia. And when you go through my CV, it makes me realize how very, very old I am. Um, so yeah, I'm delighted to be here today. And Anastasia, thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm really excited to be speaking to fellow economists here. I often speak to different groups, and it's nice to kind of come home to the fold, so to speak. And so what I'm going to talk about is the work that we have been doing at Morphosis on adaptation. I came into this area about a year and a half ago because I'm a development economist. I mean, as you sort of mentioned through many of the things I've done, I focus a lot of my time and my sort of passion is around human development, and particularly people at the bottom of the pyramid. And adaptation, I mean, on one hand, mitigation was seen as, maybe something that could not be drained by spending on adaptation, but I think it was also seen perhaps as a defeat to spend instead on adaptation. But at the same time, if you look at many parts of the world, including Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, that I focus on, they've really contributed nothing to climate change, and they are facing daily the challenges. And so asking them to pay for mitigation rather than thinking about how to get more resources into adaptation is almost criminal, actually, from my perspective. And so I came into this arena because adaptation is really where sort of the development discussions and the green economy discussions come together. So with that, let me just maybe put this into context. Hard to just jump into talking about the adaptation economy and climate without looking at all the other things that are happening. It's almost hard to sort of wrap your head around how much is happening in the global economy and the different trends today. Of course, we have, what you might call the intelligence revolution. Mostly we hear people talking about AI. And that is also very much, about its convergence together with other technologies like robotics, Internet of Things. And this obviously is transforming the way we work. It's going to transform a lot of the aspects of our lifestyles. We have a return of geopolitics and remilitarization. In many parts of the world, it was always there. It's really come back full force in many other parts of the world. And from an economics perspective, this is taking financing away from many of the other things that we care about. Not to say that it's important or not important. Of course, defense is important, but it means that we have less to spend on a lot of the social services we need. And in my area, development, it's draining finances from that. There's a weaponization of trade, of course, that we're seeing, and sort of the deglobalization taking place, and also many tools being used that are, again, sort of at odds with globalization, things like sanctions or export controls, especially for critical minerals. We have a demographic great reversal taking place as well, especially in places like the US, Japan, China, much of Europe, which means that we're having aging societies that are reducing the workforce that can actually pay again for not just pensions, but many of the other things that we care about and need. And then finally, coming up to this, it's what I spend most of my time during my day job thinking about, which is climate and how expensive this is increasingly in terms of damages, but also the opportunities that are there. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Now, sort of going back to the sort of beginning of the discussion and how Anastasia was introducing this discussion. Until a few years ago, it would have been very hard for me to present this and not sort of be burned at the stake because it was seen as sort of heresy to admit that we were getting warmer and that we had to start sort of preparing for that and ensuring we have the goods and services that are needed in a warmer world. But the huge climate disasters, wildfires, floods, et cetera, that we've been experiencing, and the fact that we're just blowing through 1.5 degrees and heading towards even warmer temperatures, and you see some of the headlines here, basically means that it's hard for us to ignore this at this point. And the sort of the bill is coming in from inaction. And so now I think, even the Secretary General Guterres of the United Nations has admitted it as much. So we're starting to be able to have this conversation. And as I said at the beginning, from a development perspective, it's extremely important for us to think about this, but not just in the developing world, across the world, in all vulnerable regions, we will need goods and services in order to ensure that we can continue to live and prosper. So maybe just a few definitions, because I think a lot of different terms are bandied about, and sometimes it's not clear what people mean by them. So, first I'll actually talk about mitigation, which I have up there in the box. Mitigation has gotten the most attention. This is about reducing greenhouse gases, we all know, so that we don't keep getting too warm and hopefully can reverse this. And I just want to say up front, nothing that I will say today should come at the expense of that. We do need to keep working, certainly on mitigation, because otherwise we will, and we're going to see some of the numbers in a second, we will be hitting massive, massive walls. But at the same time, we do need to be thinking about some of these other issues. So first of all, adaptation. What is adaptation and what is resilience? Often we hear these two different terms used pretty much interchangeably. So adaptation for us is really the process of adjusting, changing. Resilience is more about protecting the system, right? Ensuring that you can bounce back from whatever disasters that you face. And there's something inherently sort of protectionist in there around sort of protecting, again, the status quo, whether it's desirable or not. Adaptation is much more about sort of changing the status quo, fundamentally transforming the way that we do things. And finally, I mean, if you look at most of the different scenarios that have been done in terms of expected climate change, they tend to be pretty moderate, maybe 1.5 degrees. Often, not much more than that. And it's looking more and more like it might be, quite a bit more. And so we've started talking a lot more about transformative adaptation, which is really about fundamentally shifting the way that we uh, do many different things. And then if I translate that into sort of the adaptation economy, which I'm going to be talking about quite a lot here, it's really about making sure that we're producing the goods and services that are needed in a warmer world. And there's a certain element of opportunity in this, right? I mean, it's actually massively about opportunity. And our focus is especially on low to middle income households in vulnerable regions. Again, not just global south, global north, and global south. Basically, if you have the means, you will be able to afford these things. If you don't, it becomes extremely difficult. So, now, I think just especially because we're economists on the call, just a few words about the macroeconomics of adaptation and how it's really changing the landscape. Now we know that there's the other trends that I mentioned in the beginning, but there are so many things being affected by climate. There are assets that are being stranded. Governments are having to pave and repave roads because they're being done with the materials that are not able to withstand greater temperatures, floods, storms, and so on and so forth. So the costs are running up. Actually, the cost of infrastructure repairs for municipalities in many places are already exceeding tax revenues. So it's just simply becoming unaffordable. And as we've seen, and you can see it in the graph on insurance premiums, they're going through the roof right now and becoming increasingly unaffordable. And parts of the world are becoming uninsurable, right? And so, I mean, it sounds a bit extreme, but coming from one of the board members of Allianz, which is a major insurance company. At the bottom, you have a quote that basically he said that there will be, if we hit 3 degrees, which is high, there'll be no more insurance, no more mortgages, no more real estate development, no long-term investment, no financial stability. Basically, our economies will start to crumble. And now that's the perspective from an insurer. So maybe he's, being provocative on purpose, but it's a bit scary when you think about how they are thinking about this because they are all about transferring risk and pricing risk and managing risk. And so, if we look at what is actually being done in order to deal with this, um, not much. So Bloomberg came out this year with a huge number that climate damages in 2024 were up to 1.4 trillion, right? Up from about 150 billion in 2000, according to them. Massively expensive for developing countries and advanced economies alike. And almost all of the money that's going in for the moment. Now, I have an issue with tagged adaptation spending, which if we have time at the end, we can talk about. But still, we know that the great majority of the financing that's going into adaptation, sort of protecting us from climate, is coming from the public sector. And if we look at what we're actually doing to transform our systems, the different sectors, in terms of all the regions, and on the right side of the slide, you can see it's hard to read, so I'm not expecting you to be able to really read it, but it's from a nature study in one of the nature publications from about a year ago, and it's the most comprehensive, or it's actually from a couple years ago. It's the most comprehensive research that we've seen to date that's really looking at what is happening around the world, and if countries were actually making the changes that are needed in order to be able to deal with the warmer climate, then kind of all the squares would be dark. Because it would show that they're really doing things. And what's interesting in this study is that it does two things. It looks at the extent to which actually efforts are being made to transform, and then once any efforts are made, how much impact are those are having, and they really can find hardly any linkages between either. So we're not in great shape when it comes to sort of shoring ourselves up. There's a lot that needs to be done. And mostly we've been thinking about how somehow the public sector will come in and save the day. But as I'm sure everybody on this webinar is aware, governments don't have a whole lot of money left. And as I said in the beginning, their priorities have changed, right? And they're running up massive debts, right? This is not a developing country issue. OECD countries have, debt to GDP ratios, upwards of 110% on average, sometimes much higher. We already saw a 7.1% decrease in development aid last year. And the DAC actually came out a couple months ago saying that there was a 23.1% drop in ODA last year, which is the biggest since they've started measuring. So basically, governments are just highly leveraged. They don't really have the funding that's needed to do all of this. And so clearly, private sector investment is needed. Now, the nice part of the story, the good news, is that more and more people are recognizing this. So, there's been studies done by BCG and multiple, consulting firms, but also banks and Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund has come out and called adaptation the inevitable investment, right? Because clearly these are things that are going to be needed. It's an attractive area to invest in. There's going to be a lot needed, and they're estimating somewhere between 1 to 4 trillion over the next, say, 15 to 25 years. I think that's an underestimate given the scale of transformation, but it already gives you a pretty significant idea of what different institutions are expecting, and several others, whether it's the World Economic Forum where I used to work or many other banks, they've been sort of trying to price this out, and all are recognizing that there will be investment opportunities because of needs in these areas. And this kind of is just the continuation of the inevitable investment. Mainly, I just wanted to show this to you to give you a sense of the sorts of goods and services that I'm talking about, because it can sound sort of esoteric, but these are really basic things like cooling systems, building materials that we need that can withstand greater heat, glass that can resist wind, and firefighting equipment, et cetera. This is quite a nice graph that was put together by UNEP last year that tried to show how big the demand would be and the extent to which it would be a sort of revenue generating and at different expected climate scenarios. But, which basically says things like, water treatment and weather related insurance already super important now. Things like firefighting equipment as it gets warmer are going to become even more needed. So that's all the good news. Now, the challenge is, if that were all true, the money would be going into the sort of companies that are providing these goods and services, and we all, go home happy because we have the cooling systems, the food systems, everything that we need. The problem is that the adaptation solution businesses and anybody who's kind of working in this area has heard this over and over again. Unfortunately, too often they're unprofitable. So they're undervalued and they just don't attract investment, at least not enough investment. Of course, some do. But in general, it's sort of seen as a hard value proposition, and that you really have to make your arguments for various reasons. And I think, in large part, it's because of sort of missing, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but like missing or misguided policies. You might have the wrong, construction standards for new buildings that are not, resistant to flood and the sorts of things that are happening. It could even be missing policies. A lot of it is because of the mispricing of risk. People just don't realize how warm it's going to get and the fact that they should be using different types of building materials, for example, or different cooling systems, or that they're going to need cooling systems because this heat that we're having this year is not just this year, it's forever. And so mispricing how they allocate their resources on even an individual basis. And that, is really related to expectations, which we know is so important in economics. People just don't think things are changing, and therefore they're not behaving that way. And so what we really, are emphasizing is the need for markets to be able to reward those solution businesses so that they can then scale and provide those goods and services at an affordable rate while they're actually, not going bankrupt, hopefully profitable. And again, our focus really being on low to middle income households, not because, I mean, I am a development economist and those tend to be, the households I think of more, but also because this is a huge market. And they will pay for these things, and this will, create the jobs that are needed that, will allow the economies to continue to function. Now, again, on the positive side, these distorted markets, and that's sort of our argument, they offer an attractive investment opportunity if we can get the right policy environments, if we can get the right expectations, if we can get the right risking process, pricing methods in place. And so we basically have come to the table with what we call the adaptation economy approach. The term has been used before, but not in the way that we're really taking this more holistic approach. And what we try to do, I mean, most of the discussions that take place, as I mentioned before, it's really about how government can kind of crowd in private sector investment. The idea is like, what are the nifty financial mechanisms, guarantees of first loss that somehow the government will put in place so that the private sector will miraculously put money into, which are things that the government seems to have identified that are needed. It's just not the way that the private sector works, right? And so we want to step back and think, of course, the financial markets are important. Of course, guarantees can be important. But first, we need to get the markets working. So we de-emphasize the financing gap as like a first place to start, although that's the big challenge. And instead try to take a market-based approach and think about how markets can be stimulated and how demand can be stimulated in those markets so that the goods and services can be produced. And we've sort of taken a look and we've pulled together policy, financial, and research sort of streams of analysis over the last 10 years or so. And we define the adaptation economy as the activities, policies, and institutions that deliver the goods, services, and systems that advance inclusive prosperity in a climate impacted world. That's a bit of a mouthful, but basically it's like, what are the economic conditions that allow companies that are providing the goods and services that we're going to need to thrive so that we can all thrive? And so just one way of sort of thinking about this, the OECD put together this sort of nice chart. And, it was thinking about how do you think about different goods and services, and the ones that need to be subsidized by the government, the ones that, people won't pay for and the government really has to provide, and those that are commercially viable. And they sort of did a checklist. And, I guess, these can be things that depend on public funding. I mean, government provision of things like coastal flood barriers or, large urban drainage systems. I mean, maybe private sector will get involved in general, but mostly that's probably under government purview. If you think about subsidized solutions, that can be, new seeds that are more drought or crop resistant. It could be off-grid sanitation solutions where a bit of a subsidy is needed in the beginning until the market takes root. And then finally, those things that are already commercially viable, at least to a decent swathe of the population or business. Again, things like hurricane-resistant glass or resilient building materials. And so, that kind of gives you an idea how you might put these into buckets. And I think our main argument with the adaptation economy approach is that this is true, but we should not see it as static. We need to think about how policies, incentives, proper risk pricing can push as many solutions from the top buckets down, right? Not because of any philosophical um, sort of angle that, we think that government shouldn't be doing things, but especially because government just doesn't have the financing anymore. So private sector has to do this and is much better placed. And so that's sort of how we got to, this thinking. And just a reminder to everyone that governments can and do and have created vast markets. And of course, the most famous example recently has been renewables, right? And this didn't just happen overnight. I mean, who would have thought 10 years ago that the renewables market, just really the market itself, would be a $2 trillion market? And this happened because of things happening in countries. It was basically Germany with its, feed-in tariffs, schemes. China, people might say China invested too much, but, China, allowed and created the environment for significant investments into the technologies. And now, everything's sort of shaking out, but this has driven the cost of renewables massively down, and made this a competitive sector. And similar things are happening in the bioeconomy right now. And our main point is that we need to have something, an approach like this, because if you think about sort of the playbook for renewables, it almost in any country, the playbook would be the same. The sort of the similar things about feed-in tariffs, subsidization of certain activities. And that has worked, better in some places than others, but we have that playbook. We don't have anything like that for adaptation. And partly it's because it's more complex. Obviously renewables is renewables, it's mainly one sector. But and adaptation is kind of across the economy. So it's more complex, but it makes it even more important. And also, one of the reasons that there's not really a playbook yet is because the research is starting. And so that's what we're really trying to contribute to here. So, what have we done? So now the great unveiling of our own work. That was all kind of the context. Well, and I guess the adaptation economy approach is ours. But what we did was we worked together with a number of partners, FGV, which is a leading Brazilian university, and with think tanks, Itaúsa, which is part of the largest asset management firm there in Brazil, the Paulson Institute, and others. And we came up with, I mean, I was kind of calling it our Big Bang because we're still kind of a startup just ahead of COP30, where we came out with, a lot of this research, and especially this policy framework, which I'm about to talk about, and resting on a number of other sort of white papers and, case studies, one on China, one on Brazil, two very interesting and very different economies in terms of the adaptation economy, and inspiring ourselves, of course, from a lot of good work that has been done building up. We're sort of standing on the shoulders of many giants from the past. And coming out of all of this was really this playbook. And I think the most important sort of takeaway is how we take a much broader approach than just sort of financial mechanisms to what is needed to crowd more private sector investment into adaptation. And so, again, this is our whole economy approach to transformative adaptation, the policies, institutions, and incentives that can develop and attract the talent, technology, and capital necessary to establish resilient, inclusive adaptation economies. That might sound familiar from before. And we have 7 domains of the adaptation policy framework. Now, this was our first sort of foray into this work. That is kind of our workhorse at this point. And all of these can be sort of boiled down into specific policy levers that can be useful, and useful not only to policymakers, but also to investors when they're sort of looking around the globe and trying to understand what's happening in different places, and also the companies, the solution providers thinking about where they might want to try out their different solutions. And, of course, we do have, I'll just mention a few, financial market strength because you need the financing, you need the markets to be performing well in a country for any of this to work. But there's a lot of other important areas. There's the quality and robustness of infrastructure, and there in particular, we're interested in having the right standards and policies in place to build the right things. Entrepreneurship. There's a lot of creative destruction in adaptation, almost by definition, or actually by definition. And so you need to have that sort of churning of ideas and of entrepreneurial capacity. And then, governance, et cetera, economic resilience. But one that I find particularly interesting, and I'll go a little bit more into detail into in a moment, is risk expectations and behavioral change. We see this as quite unique. And it's really how households, all of us, because we have different hats during the day, we can be a consumer at one point, we're working for the government, we're working for a company, we're working for an NGO, but how households and different individuals are sort of perceiving climate risk and how they're making their decisions based on that. So this sort of gives you the idea of how we're stepping back and taking a whole economy approach. It's a bit of like, a competitiveness strategy in a sense, but once you actually put that lens of the warming climate and how it's impacting everything that we do. So I'm suddenly changing the colors here because we then continued working on this. And in Davos this year, we came out with a pilot of an adaptation economy index. So anybody who might know my background, and I did work at the World Economic Forum, this is something that I've spent some time in my career doing. And it's all about sort of, creating a tool that makes it easier for people to understand, to really understand where they should start making efforts. And yeah, I mean, rankings are rankings, but they do focus attention, right? So we find that it's quite useful in terms of standardizing data across different countries. And so what we did was we took those seven domains, and I'm only showing three of them here just because of space, and then transposed them and used the best data that we could find. And then we're able to cover 14 countries that were fully covered by the data. Basically, that was the deciding factor. And then we were also able to do a deep dive into the expectations pillar, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then we used the best metrics we could find, so whether it's from the World Bank, at this point it was from the OECD, from IMF, or from Lloyd's Register. They have a great survey. So all of this kind of coming together. And then I don't want to go too much into the details because this was a pilot. And I'm actually working right now on the update, which will come out just before London Climate Week in a couple of weeks. With many more countries. But just to give you an idea, because we wanted people to start getting a sense of what it meant and the fact that you could be doing quite well in one area and less well in another. So here of the 14 countries, New Zealand came first. And, it did well across a number of areas, in terms of its economic resilience, financial markets compared to others, governance, and integrity. But really facing challenges actually in terms of infrastructure. And I won't go into the details, but just to say, not everything is perfect in any of these countries. And this was on a 1 to 7 scale. No country is even getting close to being fully prepared across all of these domains once you add them up to climate. We have other interesting examples, maybe Estonia, a very small country, but really strong in terms of entrepreneurialism, governance, and, could be a good sandbox, we would say, for especially the companies, the solution providers, thinking about where they might test something out before going to a larger market. And then there's countries near the bottom that are facing, sort of challenges across many of the areas. In terms of the expanded expectations pillar, I was able to do it for 112 countries, which was kind of nice. And here, I see this a bit as sort of latent demand. If the society realizes that it's getting warm and they're starting to prepare for it in different ways, and we have different measures for that, then they're most likely more open to, purchasing the sorts of goods and services that will be needed. I won't go into the details, but you have countries like South Korea and even the US actually, but Senegal and others that actually do realize that something's going on. So we would say there's kind of more latent demand there. What's interesting is I I we then organized it by region, and what we find is that actually North America seems to be the most aware and preparing, and the least preparing is the Middle East and North Africa, which, given the challenges that they're facing, feels a bit like a blind spot. So that's just kind of an interesting takeaway. And in general, the fact that risk perception is not correlated with income, I mean, that's not surprising. And again, no, you see out of seven, no country is even close to like fully understanding the magnitude of what they're facing. Now, two other kind of interesting little experiments that we did is we wanted to compare our results, so the adaptation economy, kind of a preparedness, I guess, for being able to create the markets needed so that you can get the goods and services out to the public that are needed, and with a measure of climate vulnerability itself. That's one of the reasons I kept that out of the index, because we want to be able to compare, how prepared you are from actually how bad things might get. And there, we used one of the ND gain from Notre Dame, their climate vulnerability sub component of a similar index that they do. And again, you could do some quadrant analysis. This will be much more interesting in the report that I'll come out with quite soon. But it does give you an idea that, you can kind of get a sense of the countries like New Zealand or Portugal that are doing more to kind of build their markets, for example, and that actually are facing, not that they're not facing any climate vulnerability, but maybe a bit less than some of the other countries. Indonesia, that's making some efforts, although facing massive climate challenges in that sort of upper right-hand corner. And then those countries that are really critically fragile, like Colombia and Peru, that are not preparing significantly according to the, sort of seven areas, and that also are facing massive climate vulnerabilities. Um, and then the other sort of external comparator that I think is quite interesting is government debt, because again, as we said, the whole reason that we're doing this is because government doesn't have enough money to pay for everything that we need. So this gives a sense of the urgency when we sort of put the Adaptation Economy Index again on the vertical axis, and now government debt on the as a percent of GDP on the horizontal axis, and then you sort of start seeing again, a country like New Zealand, which doesn't have too much debt, and that is preparing, versus a country like Greece that is preparing a bit, but that is massively constrained. And so, just these things give a sense of which countries might need to prepare even more, or that can actually use the fact that they have more government resources theoretically at their disposal in order to prepare for a future that inevitably will, I think, touch just about all countries. So just kind of getting to the end of my presentation, and Anastasia, I think I've been pretty good about sticking to 40 minutes. I think what is the point of all of this? And we're going to be improving it over time. And we've been doing consultations. If anybody's interested in helping and providing some input, please let me know, because we're certainly interested in smart economists letting us know what's missing, what they like, how it can be useful. And we'll be coming out, I think, mostly with an updated methodological paper with some new rankings in a couple of weeks. And then more towards the end of the year, I think more the index, where we're really going to be talking about much more about the results, because maybe by then we'll feel like it's ready for prime time. And I feel like I'm running regression after regression. At some point I have to get it out there, but we do feel like it's good for us to be having a long consultation process before we fully put this into the public domain as a tool that we think is ready. But so as this is, sort of coming out and becoming developed, and the policy framework, I mean, what are the things that this can be useful for? Because it's a different kind of framing. It's a new kind of framing. I think what we're hoping that countries will do, because we hope that this is helping to shift the way that we think about things, also bringing much more of a positive spin to what is generally a pretty depressing picture. We can create more goods and services. Companies can thrive by doing this. They can provide not just what we need, but also employment and so on. First, just start by mapping what's happening. If you sort of start thinking about what the adaptation economy is, and from that, building roadmaps. What are you doing well? What are you doing less well? What will help to unleash these markets for the good? Measuring after that how well things are going, and then especially, I guess, for multilateral development banks and other partners, really thinking about policy-based loans, sustainability linked debt. These should provide some KPIs that would be helpful in thinking about that. And by the way, for countries that are preparing well, what we hope is that, sometimes countries are unfortunately just in the wrong part of the world, and so their sovereign debt ratings are, much lower, just because of, sort of geography. And what we hope is that this will actually be a positive. If you're preparing well, you can actually have a lift in your ratings. And finally, obviously, we hope that this will help in investing in adaptation solution businesses. So just to sum up, I think, what we recognize is that there's really quite a massive storm happening, and there's overvaluation of some of the wrong assets. There's undervaluation of the things that we're going to need. Governments don't have money right now. And we see the bubbling up. I mean, we're kind of putting a name on something that's happening and trying to figure out how to accelerate it. We're starting to see the rise of this adaptation economy because people need these goods and services. And so it's time to prepare because there will be market corrections in the future. We don't know exactly when. I mean, if anybody can call that, they'll become billionaires. But things will change, and policies are needed to make sure that we're prepared for the future. And government, in my opinion, should be really focusing on that more than trying to spend its way out of everything. Should be really thinking about what are the policies that are needed to allow the markets to provide this. And so we think that this is a helpful way of thinking about adaptation in a positive way and how we can invest in a different way so that we have all the goods and services that are needed in the future, across the population so that we can not just live but thrive in a warmer world. And if you would like to see all the work that we've done, you can see that here in investing in the rising adaptation economy. The QR code should take you straight to our website, and you'll find lots of stuff there. And if you have any problems with that, let me know. So with that, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. That's an incredibly interesting presentation and ideas and amazing work. I have one question before I sort of we go to the questions from the audience. And the question is, you identify 7 policy domains, from economic resilience to social cohesion. Which 2 or 3 do you see as the most critical bottlenecks right now, and why?
Um, so I think that expectations is a huge one because so much rides on expectations, right? That's how we're pricing our risk. And so I think we really need to get a handle on why it is that people just don't believe what is happening in front of their eyes is happening, you know? And so I think that is, and government really does have a role to play in that in terms of ensuring that we, sort of certain levels of transparency in terms of risk, and also information campaigns and just admitting that something is happening. I think infrastructure as well, and especially standards around infrastructure. There was a really interesting discussion last year at a conference on adaptation, and there was a German mayor who came, and she was showing pictures of her town before and after these horrible floods, which you might remember happened. And she was saying, okay, this is my town before the flood, and this is my town after the flood. And she was saying, but my problem is when I rebuild, the standards are going to force me to rebuild the old way, and so I'm not prepared for the next flood. So I think a big thing is the standards that not only do people not realize, so you have the expectations, but the standards are sort of reinforcing the wrong choices, I would say. And then I guess entrepreneurship and finance, which is the final one, which is if this stuff has to be paid for and you have to have people who are um, kind of motivated to go out and find those ideas and roll them out and create businesses. So I think those are sort of, I mean, in a nutshell, the three kind of unique things that if I had to prioritize, and they're three big chunky things, but I think that those are quite important to prioritize.
I mean, it's also, from what I hear is that sometimes, the regulations and the policies that are rolled out, they contradict each other. So they create confusion, or, a lot of these policies, quote unquote, they leak. So the end result is
Yeah.
not the wished one.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So sorry, go on.
no, 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 go ahead, please.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, that just shows the necessity for policy coordination across ministries, for example, in a government, right? But on top of it, I think the last thing we want, I mean, environment ministries do a really important job on certain things. This is not something that should be under the purview of the environment ministry, right? This should be the finance ministry, this should be the prime minister or the president. These are really fundamental issues that cut across everything. And so, first of all, yeah, you definitely need policy coordination, but it's also about who's responsible, right,
Yeah.
for these.
So we have one question from Oliver Herman. He's asking, why do you use the country as a unit of analysis? Adaptation and adaptation solutions are specific and usually localized. Um, he and I'm assuming his colleagues used geo-referenced analysis and remote sensing data to do the analysis and policy proposal. So I guess that's
Okay.
an alternative.
So it's a really good point, Olivier. And so we're starting with countries as the unit of analysis because that's where we can get the data. And often many of the policies that we're talking about are made at that level. But we fully understand at the subnational level, for example, the rubber often hits the road either at the state level or the city level or whatever. So we do have every intention to translate this work into more nuanced analyses over time. But we will need to be able to, I mean, there has to be somebody making the decisions there, right? And we have to be able to capture the data and more than it goes beyond just data that you can kind of capture with the, satellites and so on and so forth. Sometimes it's just literally people's perspectives on things. And we also want to do sectoral analysis, right? So we want to understand what's happening if it's the food sector or water and sanitation and so on and so forth. So, and even down to the asset level, ideally, eventually, to understand what different companies are doing in different jurisdictions to the extent that we can come up with that. So I think it's a really good point. You can even say when there's climate, why are you looking at something when these are cross-border flows of, you know, carbon or whatever. But right now, our main unit of analysis that are used for these cross-country data sets are countries, and so that's where we're starting.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody else from the audience has a question. I have another one. At the beginning, you mentioned these mega trends, so the geopolitics, the AI that are shaping the current investment landscape. So I was wondering, do you think that any of these forces might actually accelerate the adaptation economy rather than just, adding to a polycrisis? So that's another sort of webinar we had where all these mega trends actually lead to a polycrisis. But I don't know what your opinion is in terms of whether actually one of them could accelerate the adaptation process.
Well, we could probably have like a full day of, debate on just that topic, which is super interesting. I think if you look at AI in particular to start with, um, everything, the flavor of the day is AI, right? So like everybody wants to invest in AI. The biggest companies for the most part, in every stock market index, or certainly in the US, are AI driven. And all, the governments around the world are trying to figure out how to sort of seize that. And we kind of recently cheekily did a debate session called We Can Live Without AI, but Not Without Food. And I mean, it was really about the fact that there's a misallocation of capital, right? There's so much money going into AI. And of course, some of the AI guys came and said, oh, but AI can help. And so I fully agree. Like AI can help us solve, like, in discovery for solutions. But the reality is, we know that so many of these companies are going to collapse. There's a bubble. I mean, maybe not AI overall, but in individual companies, and there is that misallocation. So that's one trend. And then if I think about sort of geoeconomics and security issues, I think that's actually going to accelerate things in another direction. Because if you think about adaptation and what it means, at least we have an investment thesis. And one part of it is that there'll be a lot more decentralized infrastructure, right? I mean, you're not going to build like the big sewer systems anymore. You're going to have decentralized next generation sort of off-grid sanitation, for
Huh?
example, right? And frankly, in developing countries, they were never going to get that in many parts of the countries. So because you can't get stuff anymore, it's sort of accelerating that, and then sort of
Okay.
circular economy and all these other things. So because all these things are happening, I think it's going to push more quickly towards this balkanization, which I'm not necessarily a fan of, but it just is something that's going to be happening where countries need to be more self-reliant, whether it's for food, et cetera. And so I think that's something that's actually pushing in the same direction to get us to invest more in adaptation, right? Because it's fundamentally changing the way that we think about supply chains and how we source and produce. And then what I think is eventually the AI craze will do what these crazes usually do, which is like you'll have some very successful companies and it will have transformed the way we do many things. And then money will come back and hopefully um, we'll go into some of the things that we really need for the future. That's I mean, I'm an eternal optimist, so I can't help it. And otherwise, how can you get out of bed in the morning, right?
Uh, I fully agree with you. There are two more questions. One question is, could some adaptation credits be developed similar to what we have with carbon credits? For example, with financing for rebuilding in Ukraine and Palestine, Lebanon, etc.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's the sort of creative thinking that we need. And if somebody wants to do a master's or a PhD on that, or maybe Anastasia, you guys want to work on that. Look, I mean, we already have biodiversity credits, and we're quite involved in talking to some of the providers of those. And it's super interesting, when you think about that, it's a market-based approach to try to get a solution that we need. Um, I think that bonds or any sort of financial mechanism that can help us to sort of collect and then put money into specific efforts makes a lot of sense. I would just again encourage it to have a market-based approach, rather than sort of giving the money then to the government to try to go figure out those things. Government will always have to do certain things, but so many of these things need to be provided by the private sector. So yes, and let's think through what that means. And I mean, I think our big goal is that this will like sort of generate a lot of interesting thinking like that, and we'll come up with some super interesting, outcomes and mechanisms.
Idea. One more question, Jennifer. In framing adaptation as an emerging market for private investment, we often group very different things under the broad rubric of adaptation investment opportunities. from resilient infrastructure and water systems to agriculture, insurance, data, cooling, etc. From an investor perspective, what market signals are most important to distinguish these opportunities and turn adaptation needs into investable markets with clear demand, revenue models, risk allocation, and measurable value creation?
Well, that the question had the answer in it, right? I mean, that's what we need. We need like a good sense of the future flow. And I agree. This is broad, and we're kind of trying to define. It's not really a new asset class. This isn't a new asset class. This is just a new approach to thinking about um, all different kinds of goods and services that will be needed, right? And the sort of policy framework that is needed for them. But yeah, it's all about future flows of revenue. It's about, what do you expect the market to be? Can people, what is the price point? I mean, all of the really traditional things. And we're working on it right now to try to make this easier for investors to understand. But I think maybe one of the, most interesting parts of it is that it's so broad. And and in a way, it's sort of and maybe that gets them annoyed because you want to just have an answer of one thing, but it's almost like a prism for looking across the economy and looking at multiple sectors in order to understand what needs to happen. Now, when I mentioned before to Olivier's question about what we plan to do in terms of deep dives, we fully understand that we're going to have to get granular on this, which is why we're going to take a look at, food system. We're going to look at, different aspects that are needed. We're going to look at water and sanitation. We're going to look at construction and so on, because I think that makes it a lot easier to try to understand for investors what will be attractive, and why they will allocate their money there. But and just sorry, one last thing. When investors are looking at opportunities around the world, they're looking at the opportunity of that particular company and its operations, but they're also looking at the operating environment, right? And they're looking at if they have expansion plans, what's happening in those different environments. And so I think the work that I showed today, like that we're already doing, is really about understanding that macro picture as they're doing that microanalysis. And then we're going to get more and more into the microanalysis as we go forward, working with many others, because we're a small team. We're trying to start a movement here so that we can all, yeah, really have an approach that will make sure we don't go straight into a wall, which is unfortunately what I think we're doing right now.
Thank you, Jennifer. I don't see any other questions, but we're also reached the end. Very interesting presentation. And given that this is the last webinar of the winter spring season, I think we are closing the season with a bang because it was a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Thank you all for attending our webinar today. We're going to be on hiatus until the end of August, and we're starting with a new series of webinars at the beginning of September. So thank you very much. Thank you, Jennifer, and have a nice summer, and we'll see you in September again.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Anastasia, and thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.